Hello and welcome back to 2W Conversations, the only podcast where eavesdropping on us isn't rude but welcomed. Today's conversation is going to be a good one. I have two great experts here ready to talk about firewalls. So guest number one, Ryan, he's our IT supervisor here at 2W.
Hello.
And Paul, sales manager over at Western NRG. Paul, where are you calling from today?
So again, Western NRG, we're based here in Camarillo, California.
Awesome. It's beautiful out there.
It is, yeah. And before anything, I just want to say thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a treat to get to interact with you guys all the time. So even more so in a space like this.
Thank you for hopping on. You too, Ryan. I did want to start by, and Paul kind of emphasized it, it is NRG in terms of the letters, not energy. I did make that mistake when I first started. So aside from the name of your company, do you want to talk a little bit about what you guys are doing right now?
Sure. So we have been around for a little over 30 years now. We started off in our CEO's garage here in Ventura County, and we've blossomed into what we are now, which is a close to 50 employee security firm here in Camarillo. We occupy 2 buildings and a professional suite. And we used to do stuff for the internet before the internet was kind of a thing. Magnum routers is kind of where we started at, and then have just kind of transitioned over time. And when it came to security, we wanted to go all in on one brand. And the reasoning behind that is it's really nice when you have people who are generalists, people who are good at a lot of very different things. Mm-hmm. But we think it's important when you have a specialist, someone who is excellent or excels in a particular field. So we decided to be security experts, and we leaned in on the SonicWall brand. So we also found that the customer base that we have, needed additional assistance with configuration, installation, and support. Growing from just selling a firewall, we now do professional services. And again, we've been doing those for about as long as we've been selling the SonicWall product. So, but as the threat landscape changes over time, the necessity for just a firewall has to expand as well.
I love your take on how important it is to go into specializations versus generalize. It's kind of like a restaurant menu, right? If you go to Olive Garden and they have a huge menu, everything's just going to be meh.
Totally.
And we've been a partner, I think now for almost a year, I want to say.
I think it's been a little bit longer than that. Yeah.
A little bit over a year.
Yeah,
okay. Awesome. Yeah, and we've been able to see all the benefits from our clients that have been using SonicWall. So very grateful for the partnership and very excited to see where it goes in the coming years.
That's fantastic.
So with that, let's dive right into the topic. Before we get into the specifics of firewall, let's start with just the basics. So Ryan and Paul, do you want to start by just giving an overview of what a firewall is and the main role it has in your network security?
The firewall is basically like an edge device. It separates the internal network from the external internet traffic. So, and traffic that travels in between the two gets basically has to travel through the firewall. So, you can use it to set up security, prevent traffic from going in or out. And also there's advanced features that they often include or can include for virus scanning, email scanning, content filtering, things like that. There's the possibilities, I don't want to say are endless, but there's a lot of possibilities with what you can do with a firewall.
Just kind of piggybacking off of what Ryan's talking about, it's a really good way for, companies to help ensure that their data, that, their internal resources are protected, because, I often refer to the internet as the Wild West. And so when you allow the Wild West into your private organization, you don't know what's going to happen, or more to the point, anything can happen. So having that firewall in place, I like to attribute a lot to having like a bouncer at your door, right? You want to tell the bouncer who's allowed to come in and who's not allowed to come in. But also at the same time, you do want some security there. You want to make sure that the people that you are allowing in are safe and don't have malicious intent when they are let through the door. So the firewall is there, as to Ryan's point, to help determine who comes in and who doesn't. But also at the same time, through security licenses on the firewall, you can inspect web traffic, web pages for viruses and malware. With the SonicWall product, they have their advanced threat protection that checks for 0-day threats. So, not just depending on what the network let me rephrase, not just depending on what the industry knows to be dangerous, but also taking a proactive approach to checking for new and unknown variants of malware, because you don't want to be the first person to be hit with something. If you wanted to make sure the right type of content was allowed into your network with things like content filtering, you can do that. So, and then segmenting, your network, if you want to keep your sales traffic different from your accounting traffic and things like that. So the use of a firewall, I would think, is kind of bare minimum for any reputable organization or company that is going to be on the internet. And let's face it, who isn't on the internet today? So definitely kind of a minimum requirement staple of any network.
Yeah, I always use the bouncer example too to explain it to people, because I feel like that does the best job.
Super relatable. Yeah.
Yes.
100%.
So as we talk about firewalls, are these pretty standard across the board, or are there some additions that you can add to a firewall if companies choose to? What does that look like?
I kind of like to think of the firewall as an implicit denial, right? Like, hey, I don't want anybody coming into my network, keep me safe. But if I'm going to, conduct business on the internet, email, things like that, then I do need to allow some traffic to come in. So having those security licenses bundled with the firewall helps really kind of get you to be granular with the level of access that people will have into the network and what people can access out from outside in. But yeah, the firewall is not the end all be all appliance to network security. And when people check email, they usually think that, well, I get email from the internet, so my internet security appliance should be taking care of my email protection. But at the end of the day, there's just some limited functionality in that. I think that only really works if you're accessing your mailbox from like a web page, because that's what the firewall is designed to do, is to look at web pages. But if you want to get technical, email is a different language than web pages. Web pages are written in the HTTP protocol. Emails are written in the SMTP protocol. So you need a dedicated solution for email inspection in the same way that you would need something to inspect your web traffic. And so they're not a replacement for each other. They complement each other. And really, as I mentioned before, when you're talking about network security, those are the three big places in our eyes where malware has the most potential to make its way in. That's, through the firewall, through email, and potentially through the device itself when not behind a firewall. So the desktop antivirus does come in as a crucial component in that story. And I will say as well that ransomware specifically generally comes in through email. Email is the number one threat vector for ransomware. So it's great if we can get the firewall configured to security best practices, configured to look at encrypted traffic, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and to have that level of advanced threat protection. But if you're not doing anything for email specifically, you're really kind of doing yourself a disservice, because again, that firewall is really only one component of that story.
Yeah, well, the firewall by definition by itself is kind of a fairly simple device. It's just looking at ports, traffic, IP addresses, kind of at the base level of the network communication stack. But there's things and Paul mentioned the licensing aspect. There's things that you can add to a firewall's capabilities that really add additional security to your overall security posture. The ATP, or Advanced Threat Protection, DPI, SSL, it's actually inspecting, the SSL certificates, or not the certificates, but the encrypted traffic. Advanced Threat Protection is looking at things like the security threats. We've also got, content filtering that you can add for monitoring, web browsing and things like that. And then the DPI SSL, which would be for monitoring secure traffic, which in the past hasn't really been something that's been possible. That's just, if the traffic is secured, it's just passed through without any thought to whether or not it should be passed through. So, and that's where DPI SSL comes into play, is inspects that traffic and can determine whether or not it should be passed through.
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail right on the head there, is that, I mentioned how the web traffic is created using that HTTP protocol, but what that means in layman's terms is that that's just like plain text traffic. Anybody who's watching what you do on the internet with a plain text website can see what is going across, back and forth between your browser and that website. So if you were buying something from a store online and that website is HTTP or unencrypted, then a threat actor can monitor your traffic, obtain your credit card information, things like that. And so the internet as a whole doesn't want to operate that way, because then none of us would want to buy anything online. We wouldn't want to apply for bank loans or, feel comfortable sharing our medical history online, things like that. So the internet said, hey, we need to do this in a more secure way. And so what they did was they took that HTTP protocol and they threw an S on there. The S is for secure. And it just means that the data, the information going from your web browser to that website and back and forth is encrypted. Meaning that if I was watching what you were doing, I wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of what is, being transferred between you and that website, which is great, because now I feel more confident plugging in my credit card number or my social security number, or, sharing some medical history with my provider over the internet. But also at the same time, that does mean that the firewall can't see that web traffic. You can't see what you're bringing in. And so the potential for threat actors to inject malware on encrypted websites becomes higher, because at a certain point, they knew that firewalls weren't able to look at that encrypted traffic. It's a delicate process, the decryption process that's handled by the browser, and the firewalls in general didn't really have the ability to do that. So when I came on the scene in about 2017, we were about a year or so into SonicWall's ability to have their Gen 6 devices configured to do that. I'll spare you the ones and zeros about how that's all configured, but essentially the firewall has permission now to decrypt that website at the firewall level, at the gateway level, and check using gateway antivirus, using content filtering, checking to make sure that those websites aren't trying to deliver malicious payload. So having that ability for the firewall to look at the encrypted traffic is right in line with just having a firewall in general. And I'll say is a necessity nowadays, because we use Google's transparency report, which dictates that 95% of the web traffic that Chrome sees around the world is HTTPS encrypted. So if you don't configure your firewall to be able to look at that web traffic, you're really kind of doing your network a disservice, because you've got a firewall in place that, aside from, the access rules, the VLAN, stuff like that, from a security perspective, isn't really doing much to be able to inspect that stuff. And that's not just limited to the SonicWall. That is how firewalls in general work. So, you talk about Sophos, Fortinet, stuff like that. That's just, again, that's just how firewalls work. So you need to make sure that is configured.
So how many organizations do you think took this extra step and got these additional licenses added? And do you think it should be higher?
Great question. So when I came in 2017, we were a year or so into selling SonicWall's Generation 6 product line. So the TZ300, 400, 500, the NSA 26, 36, 46, et cetera. And because it was a newer feature at that time, I don't think that the world was ready for what that requirement is. I think if you think about what's come before it, there was so much time where customers didn't have to worry about this. Network admins and security people didn't really have to worry about it, because it wasn't much of a problem up until that point. So like with anything new, there's an argument to be made that is, well, I never had it before. I've had this firewall for 6, 7, 8, 10 years. I've been in the SonicWall for 15 years, and that's never been a thing. So why do I need that now? So it's more a matter of education, and that's largely what we strive to do here with our customers, is to educate them as to what the threat landscape looks like, how the internet is kind of configured and how it operates, and why you need these things. So I will say that in its early inception, it was a little bit more difficult because there was a lot of educating that needed to happen. But I think at this point, now that we're well into the Gen 7, right? We've had the Gen 6, the Gen 6.5, and now we're into Gen 7. Most of the customers understand what DPI SSL is and the need for that, and are already incorporating that if they haven't already. So I don't have a hard number in front of me, but I can tell you that more customers are doing that today than they were when it was first introduced, because they understand the necessity for it now. And, sad to say that usually it does take some people, to have to get hit with ransomware to be compromised, to really fully understand the necessity for these things. And so, again, it's our mission here to get in front of that for customers, to save them the headache and the time and the money to recover from compromise, if we can just get the right security up front. But sometimes, you got to touch the stove to know it's hot, so that you don't touch it again. So.
Well, and I can say that every firewall project we do now, it does include the DPI SSL piece. So
yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah. So going forward, all of our clients will have that in place as they're transitioning to new firewalls.
That's awesome. Yeah, just got to be secure. Got to be safe out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it kind of sucks that the scare tactic is what it takes sometimes, because I know our sales team, that's what they use a lot, is just talking about, we just had this client go through this huge data breach.
Right.
Maybe you should think about adding something else so you avoid that type of thing. And that's usually what gets them to click.
Right. That's a hard balance, right? Like, how do I illustrate this point for you? I can rely on anecdotes. I can tell you from experience from our customer base that this is a requirement. This is what happened to them. This is why it happened. And this is how they could have prepared themselves, as a means of, getting you to understand why you need to do that, without making that sound or feel like a sales tactic.
Yeah, exactly. So you touched on this a little bit, Paul, but thinking about how technology has evolved, how our cyber criminal interface has evolved, how has these firewalls or the cybersecurity space in general kept up with the new threats that are coming?
Yeah, great question. The bad guys, they're smart. They are very smart. And, knowing that firewalls aren't equipped to look at encrypted traffic inherently, that's where they were putting their malicious payloads. That's where they were injecting malware, was on encrypted sites. Because I know when you go to this website, your firewall's not going to do anything to inspect it. So that's where I'm going to put it. Okay. So the industry responds. Let's have the firewalls have the ability to look at the encrypted traffic. So DPI SSL, deep packet inspection for the SSL traffic, becomes a thing. Fantastic. Well, ransomware really kind of shook that up a little bit, because ransomware was relatively new back in 2017, or at least becoming very popular. And the thing with ransomware is that it's so easy to just change specific lines in code that you can change certain viruses to be different every single time. And the reason that that's important is because of how antivirus works, right? Antivirus is dependent upon a database of known threats. It's when organizations or individuals become infected with malware that the community becomes aware of it, and they can take that code and they can create what's called a signature, or like a digital thumbprint of that malware, and say, okay, this code equals bad. And so when that code tries to come into your network through a website, or maybe a malicious PDF, something like that, the antivirus on the firewall is going to say, hey, let me check the code of this thing against my encyclopedia, my database of known threats. And if there's a match, then I know that this thing is bad and I'm going to keep it out. But if there's no match, antivirus doesn't say, oh, well, you're safe, come on in. It just says, well, I don't know that you're malicious. I don't have a record of you being bad, so I'm going to let you in. I liken that to, like, let's say someone was on their way to rob a bank and they get pulled over and, they're acting suspicious and the police take them in and they run their thumbprints and that person has no record, no criminal history. The police don't just say, okay, you're free to go, essentially. It's more about, and then the firewall kind of does that, right? So that person had malicious intent. You just didn't know it because you don't know their history or have a record of them being malicious. So the firewall does that, right? So, hey, I don't know that this is dangerous because you're not on my list. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to let you in. And that's not okay, because that's how people get infected. They get hit with something that's brand new for the very first time. So if the firewall is inspecting and when, let's say, something gets discovered, the IT community becomes aware of it and says, okay, this new line of code, this thing is dangerous. Let's add it to the database. Let's add it to the encyclopedia. And now we know the rest of the world can be safe who is using our, antivirus solution. But if I'm a threat actor and I change that code up just ever so slightly, well, now I have a brand new line of code. I have a brand new threat that no one has ever seen before. And the firewall is, constantly in this loop of, well, it's brand new, or I've never seen it before. I don't have a record of it. Come on in. It turns out it was dangerous. You're compromised. Let's write a signature for it. Let's make that digital thumbprint for it, and then rinse and repeat. It's a very reactive approach to inspection. So SonicWall kind of pioneered the proactive approach, and that was to develop their advanced threat protection, or capture advanced threat protection. So what this does is it allows the firewall to inspect, especially downloads like PDFs, executables, things like that, as they're coming into and through the firewall to say, hey, do I have a record of you in my database to know that you're dangerous? If I do, you're out. But if I don't, I'm not going to take your word for it. I'm not just going to trust that you are clean and safe and allowed to come in. I'm going to take that data and I'm going to put it in the cloud sandbox. And those attachments, those executables, are being opened on a virtual machine on a SonicWall server to find out what that thing does when it's opened. And if it's trying to execute code, if it's trying to make changes to the registry, if it's doing anything that looks indicative of malware on this virtual machine on a SonicWall server, then the Capture Advanced Threat Protection is going to tell the firewall, hey, this thing does something dangerous, or at least looks like it's going to do something dangerous when it's open, so we're not going to let it in.
Right.
Fantastic. It's a more proactive approach to making sure that only clean and safe data is making it through your firewall versus the reactive approach. And everybody has kind of, in the industry, has kind of caught up to that as well. So, that feature is not exclusive. That solution is not exclusive to SonicWall, but I will say that SonicWall is one of the best who do it, because that virtual sandbox is a multi-engine sandbox. It's looking at that stuff at a lot of different ways, whereas some competitors are just looking at it at one or two ways. So you get a lot more kind of eyes on what's happening in that virtual sandbox than you would with something else. So this is where we're going to kind of bridge a gap here. Having the Capture Advanced Threat Protection is not a replacement for the DPI SSL. Instead, it requires the use of DPI SSL, because you want the firewall to be able to decrypt what's coming in and then be able to say, let me run my antivirus on this, let me run my content filtering on this, and let me push this file over to this Capture Advanced Threat Protection sandbox so it can do its thing. Because if the firewall's not decrypting, it just says, well, I know Ryan requested this website and that's the IP address, the to and from. I can't make heads or tails of what the data is. So I'm just going to pass it through and hope that everything's okay. So having the DPI SSL configured helps accomplish two goals: ensuring that it can decrypt websites for the purposes of doing its general inspection, but then also to allow for Capture Advanced Threat Protection to provide that 0-day threat inspection.
Yeah.
Really kind of like the 1-2 punch, if you will.
So Ryan, is there any precautionary manual processes from an IT perspective that you guys have to do, or is it mostly automated through these solutions now?
Well, so this is a topic that could basically go on forever when we're talking about preventative measures, manual, automated. There's, just about everything can be automated in some fashion. But when we're talking about these specific tasks, there's some, obviously you want to get them set up, but in some cases there's some learning that has to happen by the service itself. The service will often get smarter over time as it learns what's malicious, what's not, as false positives are reported, or in some cases false negatives. If spam is reported or things like that, malicious items get reported. The services can learn and improve themselves and adjust accordingly. So yeah, as far as manual processes go, it may not seem like, an actual task that has to happen, but just by normal usage over time, the manual process is reporting of when the process is when the service is incorrect will improve the service over time.
Okay. And what do you say to the people, because I know, and you mentioned this a little bit, but people are sometimes worried about the latency when emails get stuck in that space where it's getting reviewed longer, or on the opposite side of things where it is giving false positives and people aren't getting the emails, for example, that they should be getting. And that's kind of a concern for a lot of people. So what do you guys say to that?
Yeah, it's an aspect of planning. You got to plan ahead. You got to make sure that you're going to be putting these services in place. You got to do the research, say here's our pipe, our internet pipe, here's how fast it is, and here's how fast we want our service to be when everything's said and done. And you got to do the math, because there's going to be rated throughputs on the services and the firewalls. And as long as you plan everything out accordingly, you shouldn't see any problems. When they do see problems, it's when they're not doing the prep work ahead of time to make sure that everything falls where they want it.
Gotcha. And just to put this in perspective for everyone, I pulled this stat. It's probably a little outdated because I know 2W has seen a huge uptick in phishing emails the last couple of weeks, but 3.4 million phishing emails get sent out a day. And this is both professionally and in personal lives. I mean, the amount of phishing emails I get in my personal email, or those texts or scam calls, there's a lot. So this aspect is super important.
Sometimes that comes down to user training, right? Because unfortunately, any network is as secure as its weakest link, right? We get so caught up in our day-to-day between our instant messengers and our email and, putting out fires and wearing different hats, that threat actors are relying on that for us to not be paying attention and just simply kind of oversee something and just click on something. And then there you go. It's the end. It's payday for them. So having the right layers in place to help mitigate that, in addition to user training, that I think is a really crucial component as well to the security story. But, we want to try to minimize the risk as much as possible for users. So having the right firewall in place with the right security services is step one. And then that email security is a second step, right? I'm going to try as hard as I can to train my users to spot these things in emails to minimize the risk of them clicking on something they shouldn't. But if I've got something in place that's going to help keep all that stuff out already and ensure that almost any email that comes into a user's inbox has been inspected, is clean and safe, and confident that, it's an okay email, then combined with that user training, I feel much better about, having email come in than if it was just unattended or unaddressed. So email security is a crucial component to network security for sure.
It's funny because I have a lot of friends that forward me emails now, just working in tech, saying, is this safe? And I can, most of the time it's one of the simple ones where, okay, the URL or the domain that it's coming from is misspelled. So no, probably not safe. And yeah, it goes to the point where awareness is huge, and a lot of these other companies don't get that.
Yeah, 100%. And you got to think about it conceptually too. There are so many variants of phishing, right? Phishing just kind of I think everybody's kind of familiar with that term. We're starting to become more familiar with it, at least like, from a private, citizen perspective. The industry has known about it for a while, but phishing is literally the act of just throwing something out into the ocean and waiting for somebody to come and take a bite. But there's also spear phishing, right? So if I'm looking for someone individually, right, like a CEO, C-level executive, or upper management, I'm going to target them directly. Now we've transitioned from phishing to smishing, which is the SMS, the text-based phishing. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who gets, at least 1 or 2 text messages a day saying, my package is on its way. I can track the delivery by clicking this link or things like that. So I think what you're seeing is a reactiveness by the malicious community in seeing that more and more organizations are getting dedicated and better aligned with the right security solutions and kind of trying to figure out different ways to achieve the same results. So definitely not where we need to be from a security perspective, because just like DPI SSL and Capture ATP were a little bit new and foreign to customers, firewall customers, when those things were out, I think the need for email security inspection and the need for next-gen desktop antivirus are similar in that customers don't really know or understand why they would need to up the level of security. What we've done in the past isn't good enough anymore. And so we need to move into that space. So I think we're kind of right in that exact same spot where it's just education and reinforcement of what you need to do and what we have available to help accomplish those security goals and keep you safe out on the internet.
Yeah, smishing is scary because I feel like for me personally, it's way easier to accidentally click a link that just pops up on my phone and I'm usually out doing something versus at work, you're kind of hopefully in that mindset of, okay, it's a possibility, it's phishing.
I got a text message this morning delivered as a group chat with 9 other phone numbers. So I have to go in there and, well, I don't have to, but I want to go in there and block each one of those numbers because I don't know who they are. And then have to, hide the alerts and then delete it and mark it as spam. There are so many steps that I need to take that, to your point, it's easy for me to just accidentally click on the thing I'm trying to avoid as a matter of staying safe. So, like I was saying, if I had something up front that I could deploy on my phone, and maybe there is, I just haven't taken the time to look, to help mitigate the number of instances that I'm going to receive those types of messages, I would do that to make my day and my life a lot easier. And that, I think that's just kind of my point in having the right firewall, having the right email security, having the right desktop antivirus. All of that is preventative. I'm going to spend a little bit of money up front to make sure that none of that stuff gets in, or at least minimize those instances, so that I or my network and my employees don't run the risk of inviting a compromise into my network and then spending the time to recover from that, spending the money to recover from that. I think that's a crucial component, which is that most people look at the cost of these solutions up front and say, I don't think I can handle that, or I don't think I want to do that now, but don't realize the time, the energy, and the money it takes to recover from data compromise.
For sure. So moving on, because we talked about email security and firewalls, there is that important third layer that businesses should implement, and that's endpoint security. And to the cost point that you just made, the average cost of a data breach that comes from an endpoint vulnerability is over $4 million. So if that helps put it into perspective at all for people that are a little hesitant on spending the money to put the endpoint security in place, let's talk about that in terms of why that's also important to add on top of these other security measures.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a solid security posture, it really should be a layered, you want to take a layered approach. So, we talked a lot about, the email security and encrypted traffic and all these things, but there's no solution that's perfect. And, we talked about how smart the bad actors are. They're always trying to improve their tactics. So it's a constant back and forth. You want to make sure that, if something gets through, the end users, you give them all the training you want, but sometimes things get missed, something gets clicked on. You got to make sure you have the layers in place. And endpoint security is going to be one of those first layers, the first lines of defense against those things that are finding their way through. You got the layers at the firewall, the email security. You're training your users. You might have MFA on their accounts, all these things. But if they're clicking on stuff, the first thing that's going to get impacted is their desktop, their endpoint. So that endpoint security is the layer that's going to stop it right there in its tracks if that happens. And most security packages nowadays are going to be, like Paul said, if they're good, they're not going to be signature based. They're going to be like a heuristic or like a machine learning type approach where it will recognize behaviors instead of specific file signatures. It'll see actions being taken on a computer and say, hey, something's going on here. Let's put a stop to this. And that's like I said, it's the first line of defense when something actually gets through to your end users. Definitely important.
Mm-hmm. We were in a meeting internally and we were pulling up the Microsoft scorecard and looking at all the recommended actions within this company just as a training purpose. And numerous amount of recommendations, but each recommendation was less than 1% effect towards the security scorecard. So it was a good visualization to see security isn't just one thing. You don't get a firewall, you're done. You don't get even just these three and you're done. It's all these little things that pile up to make you comfortable and make your business actually secure. And it's an ongoing thing that you have to work on as your company grows.
Yeah, it really has to be integrated into every aspect of the business. Every decision that's made, you need to use the security lens when evaluating, whether or not it's appropriate to make that decision. Any new projects, any old projects, things that are getting decommissioned, any new processes, there should definitely be a security aspect when those things are undertaken. Mm-hmm.
So is there a typical order that's recommended in terms of what to implement when? Or is it you'll take what you can get? If they implement something, it's moving forward?
I mean, it's gonna be very situational. It's going to depend on what kind of infrastructure is in place, what kind of services are being used, how big the user base is, whether it's, a local user base or spread out across multiple locations. There's so many variables. And that's why, for that reason, you kind of have to look at every aspect or every part of the infrastructure, every part of the company to make sure that the proper security is in place in the proper places, So if there's different locations communicating, over a connection, you got to make sure that connections is secured. You got to make sure all the user endpoints are secured. So at each layer of the infrastructure, there should be a layer of security that goes along with it, at least one layer. And so you want to look at, the infrastructure or the environment as a whole and make sure that you've got all your, the security holes plugged at each layer. So it's not easy. It's definitely a challenge to stay on top of, and things are always changing as well. So it goes back to the battle of, good versus evil. The bad actors are always fighting. The security services are always adapting to the things that the bad actors are changing. Mm-hmm. People in my standpoint, we have to always be vigilant and we always have to be, ready to adapt and change based on the latest threat or the latest change to the security environment.
Yeah, that's why technology providers have the industry that they do, and Western NRG has the company that they do, is because we're there to do the research for you and hand you that information and give you recommendations based on what we know.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
Yep.
Do you ever see anyone that comes in and they have, let's say, these three pillars checked off, the email security, firewall, endpoint, and they almost get overconfident with everything that they're doing and think that they can almost do anything and get away with it?
Yeah, absolutely. Complacency is fairly common. Like I said, it goes back to vigilance. Paul, I don't know if you have anything to add, but it's not uncommon.
Yeah, especially if you don't have the right things in place. So, even at a basic level, you can have a firewall, you can have desktop antivirus, and you can have some level of email inspection and think, I've got all the things, so I'm good. You're telling me I need those things? I've got those things. I'm great. The problem with that, though, that we see a lot of times is that when we are taking on new clients for the first time, if they do have a firewall in place, is it configured to best practices? Is it even configured at all? I can't tell you how many times we've taken on new customers who bring us either an existing Sonic Wall firewall or a competitive one and said, well, this IT guy that I had from a couple of years ago configured it when we first bought it. He's no longer here. We need some help with it. Or, we have to contract out our IT support because we don't have a department. So, we pay Joe's IT shop, $200-$300 an hour to come in and do whatever it is that we need to do, only to find out that when we get into those things, maybe those licenses were never even activated in the first place. Maybe that person just configured it well enough so that internal users can get access to the internet. Mm-hmm. Great. As an accounting rep, as a customer service rep, I don't know what's happening on that, through that firewall. All I know is I need to get to the internet and I need the internet to get to me. And if it's going to go through the firewall, then great. If I can do that, fantastic. It's working. Mm-hmm. But it turns out it's not doing the thing you want it to do, which is that level of inspection, that checking for viruses and malware. So you can have a firewall, but it doesn't mean that it was configured properly or set up properly or is doing the thing that you want it to do.
Yeah, that was perfectly said. I think I can speak for all of us when I say the main message here is that security is a layered approach and everything else should continue to change as your business does. On that note, I am looking at time here and I think we should wrap it up. Paul, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with us today. Nothing's better than speaking to people who are truly passionate about what they do. Again, we are so grateful for a partnership we've created with you and everyone over at Western NRG, and I'm sure we'll talk soon. As for the rest of you listening in, you know the drill. Like and subscribe.